Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Dr. Laura Gellott, retired University of Wisconsin-Parkside history professor. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much, Carl.
When did you start at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside campus?
I started in the fall of 1982.
Okay, and what is your background in education?
Well, I did my undergraduate at Marquette University and then stayed there and got my master's degree. I wanted the opportunity to be a teaching assistant early on in my graduate career. I then went to UW-Madison, did my PhD there, and it was in the months that I was finishing my dissertation that I interviewed for the job at UW-Parkside and was offered that. And that was February of '82. And then I came down here and started with the fall semester.
Okay, are you from this area originally?
No, I grew up in Michigan. I grew up in Ypsilanti, Michigan, literally in the shadows of Eastern Michigan University. But my father is a Milwaukee native. My mother is from Ypsilanti. They had met at Marquette, so they encouraged me to check that out. And I fell in love with the Marquette campus at first look, and that's where I then went for undergraduate.
Okay, and
I've been a Wisconsinite ever since.
Ever since you came to
Ever since I came to
as
Marquette
a college student?
in 1970, yes.
Okay. And you said you applied at Parkside. Did you apply anywhere else?
Yes. Tenure track academic jobs, especially in a field like history, English, are not easy to come by. I remember there were 17 jobs nationwide that December in modern European history, and I applied for them all. And it was my great good fortune that the application that went the furthest, I had several interviews, but the one that went the furthest was the job at Parkside, and here I am.
Happy to be here.
Yes, very.
Okay, and how long did you teach at the school?
I was there 30 years. I retired in the spring of 2012.
Okay. And what kind of courses did you originally teach at the school?
Well, certainly the survey, the European survey, divided up into three parts, a sort of Mesopotamia to the Middle Ages, as I referred to it, and then 1300 to 1815, and to the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and then the modern survey, 1815 to the present. And of course, over the years, the present was a horizon that stretched out.
Okay. And go ahead.
And then I also inherited the courses that were in the catalog, which at that time were a lot of national surveys. So British history, French history, Italian history, German history. Over time, as I became more experienced and confident, I put forward proposals to really reconfigure those, except for German history, which is my specialty. I perhaps selfishly kept that as a separate course, but the others I reconfigured into a two-semester survey of 19th century Europe, two-semester survey of 20th century Europe, and then occasional specialty courses like Revolutions of 1989, fall of the Berlin Wall, and so on, once those had happened.
Okay, so you started with the basic courses that the Parkside had already had on
Yes.
in its catalog.
Yes.
Then you developed additional courses over time.
Yes.
By the time you retired, how many courses had you actually taught or developed at Parkside?
I think my repertoire over that time was 13 courses. I remember counting them up. And of course, many of those I taught multiple times,
Okay.
but 13 separate courses.
Okay, and you mentioned your interest is in European history.
Yes.
When did you become interested in history?
I became interested in history already in grade school. The Catholic grade school I went to had split grades, so I was in a 5th, 6th combination. We 5th graders were doing geography, the 6th grade side of the room was doing history, and more I found myself listening, in the time I should have been working on my geography assignment, listening to what sister was teaching to the sixth graders on the other side of the room. And I would even borrow a history textbook from a sixth grader to take home and read overnight and get back to her in the morning. So it really goes back to, I suppose, 10 years old.
And is there history in your family in terms of the study of history?
Yes, my mother was a history social studies teacher, and her brother, my uncle, was a PhD history professor. And he was finishing his dissertation at the University of Michigan, round about the time I was in 6th, 7th grade. And he was happy to feed this burgeoning interest in history and would bring books home for me from the U of M library, primarily biographies of European dynasties.
Okay. And your interest in European history came from your uncle, your mother, or did you develop that particular interest on your own?
It came from them, because that's what they were interested in, especially my uncle. He was doing a degree in medieval studies, which is European at that time. These books that he brought me. And my mother also gave me a book, even before this, I was maybe 9 years old, a book about a mother-daughter trip through Europe that she had read at that age. And I can still remember her saying, "Here, you'll like this. It's about a girl who goes to Europe." And I was just fascinated by this place that seemed almost magical. Europe. Can you still go there? Are these things still here? And many years later, I found the granddaughters of the woman who wrote that book in 1937, and that led to me publishing a biography of that woman. What year is this? 2020, 3 years ago I published that book, and I've had a lot of fun with it and some monetary success. And so really I trace my interest in Europe back to that thinly fictionalized story of a mother and daughter traveling through Europe.
Okay, and now you're at Parkside as a professor.
Mm-hmm.
What were the students like at Parkside in 1982?
Well, from the start, I really enjoyed the students. What I noticed right away, in contrast to my teaching assistant experience at Marquette, and that I had also been invited back to Marquette when I was finishing my dissertation to teach as an instructor. So I had probably a total of about 4 years teaching at Marquette. And those, like I had once been, were typically 18 to 22-year-old students, typically living in the dormitories, typically from a middle class and up background. And at Parkside, I just saw such a wonderful diversity of students. In age, that was one thing that really struck me. And at the time, and I believe it is still the case, Parkside had the largest number of non-traditional students.
Which is what?
Over 22. Maybe they even say over 25. So adults who had either had their education interrupted at some point, or who had never gone to college, but now having raised their children or completed a military career, were coming back. So the non-traditional students, the greater socioeconomic range of students, still to this day, I mean, Parkside has 38% of its students are Pell Grant eligible. And while the qualifications for that are formulaic and complex, basically low income. So certainly that range. And what this translated into in the classroom, of course, this great diversity, which forced me to rethink just some of the examples that I often unthinkingly used, like, well, you all know such and so. Well, maybe they didn't. But because they had, many of them, this greater range of experience, because at the beginning, in my beginning, 1982, Parkside had no dormitories. So they were still living at home. They were connected to the community, be it Racine or Kenosha. They were connected to a church. Maybe they were coaching a team. They were involved with a scout troop. So they just had a wider range of life experience that in teaching history, you're able to tap into those kinds of things and draw analogies and comparisons.
And how did this affect the campus environment as a whole?
A couple ways that I can think of right away. One, large assortment of night classes. We were all expected, the faculty were all expected to teach at least one night class a year as part of our schedule. So I tried to do this in the fall so as to avoid winter weather, but teaching a class perhaps one night a week from 6 to 9 p.m. And the campus was a busy place in the evenings. So that's one thing. And then a second, just small, practical, but telling way is that in those early years, for me, the campus did not schedule any classes from noon to 1. That was called the activity hour. So that clubs and organizations could meet during the day, because the feeling is that the younger students who are more likely to be involved in that kind of thing, by the time they leave campus at 3 or 4, they're headed for part-time jobs. They can't come back at night. So if we're going to have any kind of busy, vital organizational life here, it has to be in the daytime. So that noon hour, activity hour. So those are a couple ways I recall.
Was this open noon hour kind of a unique thing to Parkside, or did other campuses also employ this?
I can't say for certain. It was certainly nothing I had seen at Marquette, where it was very common that student organizations could meet in the evening. They were all on campus anyway, living in the dorms. So to me it was something new, and I thought, what a great idea.
Okay, and when did dormitories begin to be put in place at Parkside?
The first dormitory apartments were opened in 1985, that's my recollection, and then Ranger Hall in 1991, and that one was a real leap in terms of just numbers of students who could live on campus. There are a couple of smaller dorms that came along since, but my memory is a little fuzzier about those dates. I'd say probably the late 1990s, early 2000s.
And how did that change the student population in terms of where they came from or the type of student that was now attending Parkside?
Right. I would say that it drew more students from around Wisconsin. Students who might have gone to a La Crosse or an Eau Claire or Green Bay now had the opportunity to go away to school, or even if they had been inclined to go away to school somewhere without dorms, they couldn't come to Parkside. It also brought in larger numbers of student athletes. I mean, they could recruit more widely and with an assured place to stay rather than taking their chances with the local rental market. So I think those two ways, and it also, although we still have a substantial number of first-generation students, I think it also did tip the balance. I don't have a figure for you, but it did tip the balance a little more in favor of traditional-age students, who would be the sort who would come and live in a dorm.
Okay, and what other types of students? Did the Parkside start to see minority students at any particular time? Did students from outside of the United States start showing up at Parkside at some point?
Yes to both, and again, I regret that I don't have longitudinal statistics here. The current African American population is 7%. Still small for what it should be. The Latino population is 18%. And I would have to say, just my observation anecdotally, that the Latino population has certainly increased on campus. And I think that's also a reflection of the demographics of the Racine and Kenosha area. International students, in the late 80s, early 90s, I did a 3-year stint in administration, and one of the programs I oversaw was international students. I remember at the time we had 60 of them. And the latest figures that I checked online a couple days ago show that they now have 78. So that's a roughly 7% increase.
Where do they come from?
They see, again, the statistics online don't break it down, but in my observation, primarily Asia, a lot from China, Korea. I'm recalling that there was a specific program at one point to recruit students from South Korea and run them through a math-based undergrad and master's level program, preparing them for teaching. So that accounted for an influx there. So Asia, some from Eastern Europe, in the aftermath of 1989-90. I'm recalling a couple students from Belarus, some students from Ukraine, places where students were now free to leave and come and seek a U.S. university education.
Do you have any experience or story as to what would be the attraction of Parkside for an East European student as opposed to going somewhere else? Or an Asian student saying, oh yeah, Parkside's there, that's a good spot.
Yes. I think for the Asian students, and sometimes, you know, the stereotype does hold true, a lot of them came here for the math, the science, the computer science. One of the professors, I'm just recalling this now, Don Peely, a math professor, ran an international Olympiad of computer programming. And that was also a source of contact with students from Asia. They would meet him at this meeting and, oh, you know, you should come to our campus. And, okay, so there's that kind of math science component. We've always had a very strong pre-med program, so there is that. Other students that I've talked to talk about the small campus, you know, kind of being afraid to be in a large setting or a very urban setting like a Milwaukee or even a Madison. So they're attracted by the small size of it. In some cases, just very practical. Parkside might be able to offer them scholarship assistance that they might not be able to get at Madison or Milwaukee in a more competitive field. I'll say this, there was, in the late 80s, we had a fellow on campus who was actually a member of the royal family of Kuwait, a fact which came to light early on in one of my lectures. And I said to him one time, just talking in private, well, why are you here, Sabah? And he said, grades not good enough for Madison. Okay, well, an honest answer, but he was a delightful fellow, and certainly that added something to the discussion of a European history class. He had actually met members of European royal families, and oh yes, he'd say, I met so-and-so in Cairo.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Do you have any stories about students attending, graduating from Parkside? You mentioned first generation going to college. Any stories of students who said, you know, I'm really glad Parkside was here. I really had an experience that really helped me. Anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. And our Chancellor, Debbie Ford, who just concluded 14 years here at UW-Parkside, she liked to, in her talks, use the phrase that she heard from so many students, if not for Parkside, fill in the blank. And that's something that I heard often too. If not for Parkside, I would not have gone to college. If not for Parkside, I would never have been introduced to XYZ. I can think among my own students, and thinking at the moment also of the first generation part, a fellow who came to Parkside after being raised on a farm in Franksville, thinking that he would study business, because you got to get a job, you go to college to study business. Took a European history class with me, changed course. He is today the Dean of Libraries at the University of Iowa. And again, with an international reputation. I'm always getting emails from him from Berlin or from Paris or something where he's at a library meeting. Students who, again, many of them first generation, make up the faculty of Kenosha Unified, Racine Unified Social Studies departments. I could rattle off 6 or 7 names right now. One student I'm particularly fond of from late in my career, currently teaching at Bradford High School, is an elected member of the Racine Unified School Board, first generation. And in one of the photos I will always treasure, he and his girlfriend, another Bradford teacher, took a student group through Greece and Italy this summer, and Scott proposed to Amy on top of a mountain in Greece with the students ringing them and their phones out, taking the picture. First generation, look where Parkside took him. So there are lots of stories like that. And so that transformative nature of a UW-Parkside degree. And I think that goes both ways when we think about the number of elected officials and important people here in Kenosha who are Parkside graduates. Bob Wirch, Senator Bob Wirch, Todd Olmsted, Jim Cruiser, Terry Jacobson, County Treasurer. Yes, the impact that a Parkside education has had on the community.
You mentioned pre-med as always having been a strong program at Parkside.
Yes.
Were there any other strong programs that Parkside offered? I mean, a school can't be strong in every field, so.
Right. The theater program. In fact, there was a point in time, perhaps somewhere in the 2000s, where the theater department was designated by the UW system as a program of excellence. Likewise, the biology department, which again feeds us back into the pre-med, but the theater department with that designation. And a department that took its students to national competitions, even early on in the 80s, I remember. Their production of The Diary of Anne Frank won national awards when they took it to a competition. So that one certainly comes to mind. I was very proud of the fact in my last years at Parkside when I was serving as chair that small of a department as we were, the history department ranked second only to Madison in the percentage, not the raw number, but the percentage of students who were majoring in history. And I think that spoke very well for the kind of department and program that we had with our 7 faculty members.
Okay, can you tell me how the administration of the school worked for the university over the course of your teaching career?
Yes, I think, I did not know the founding chancellor, Chancellor Wiley. I came during the Guskin era. So Guskin, Sheila Kaplan, I think there was a real switch in focus when Jack Keating became chancellor.
How so did it change focus?
This idea of the engaged university, engagement with the community, really doing a lot more outreach programs, and that ranged everything from bringing conferences to campus to encouraging faculty to forge relationships with the high schools or with local organizations, really breaking down the ivy-covered walls. Not that we have any ivy on the campus, it's too new, but sort of metaphorically breaking down that ivy tower, ivy-covered walls, and taking the university out into the community, which really is the fullest realization of that old Wisconsin idea, which goes back to President Van Hise in 1910, that the walls of the university should extend to the boundaries of the state. And I saw that really being given some life, first under Chancellor Keating and then under Chancellor Ford in her 14 years.
Okay. In the beginning, students would go to high school, graduate, and then go to college.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, students were able to take advanced placement courses
Mm-hmm.
to go get school credit. And Gateway developed a program with Parkside for aiding students before they entered college. Can you talk about that?
Right. Well, certainly the AP courses, which I think a lot of viewers of this are going to be familiar with, and that was always a feature. The Gateway, and more broadly the statewide, what was then the VTAE system, Vocational Technical Adult Education, circa 1990-91, there was an initiative driven by the state legislature to have better transfer agreements between the UW system and the VTAE, let's just call it technical college system. That was actually during my time in administration. So I was the point person on the Parkside campus for working with our Gateway counterparts and by extension across the state.
What year was that?
1990-91.
1990, okay.
I think the agreements took effect in 91. The initial agreement was pretty limited, as first steps always are. Students completing a technical degree at one of those technical colleges had typically a 60 credit program, 2-year program, of which half were gen ed courses. And so the initial agreement was that if you had completed a technical degree, you could bring up to 15 of your 30 gen ed courses to a UW campus.
What are general education courses that are required?
English, political science, psychology, sociology. Interestingly, there was not a history class in that mix. But kind of broadly some humanities, so more social sciences coming from
Not
the
so much math or?
Math was not considered to be part of the gen ed bundle. It was considered by the technical colleges to be part of their technical package. They taught the kind of math that you needed to be a welder or name something, a police officer, you know, carpenter, yeah, good. Okay, so that was not in that initial package. But that was, I can see in retrospect, and I think I sensed at the time, the foot in the door of further sets of transfer credits. The next was a kind of program to program articulation. Well, course to course, let's say that. So take, for example, Parkside has a criminal justice major. Okay, somebody has completed the police science degree at Gateway. Well, let's take a look and see how many of those non-gen ed police science classes correspond to some of our CJ courses. All right, so course-to-course articulation, then we started talking program-to-program articulation. Then somewhere you must complete the associate degree before you can transfer anything fell aside, and people might go get 15, 20 credits at Gateway and bring those to Parkside. So that brings us to a couple of years ago where pretty much statewide, the UW system is viewing what students do at a technical college as a junior college. And anything you take in those 2 years, we will give you credit for.
Are the requirements or certifications of instructors at either place the same, or are they very different?
Well, they are different. One of the things going back to 1991 that the technical colleges gave us assurances of is that the instructors who were teaching these gen ed courses had at least a master's degree. And one of the ways in which I sold this articulation to the faculty senate, I had to get up and defend it, I held up a list of names showing that a number of the people who were teaching at Gateway in these courses, and they were typically part-timers, were also some of our part-timers in Soc, in Psych, and in English. So, okay. But broadly speaking, of course, typically at a UW campus, the faculty are going to have PhDs, and that is not the case at the technical colleges. Again, fine instructors and perhaps even a little better in dealing with incoming students than somebody who is more research-driven with a PhD. Not always. But fair to say that the qualifications are different. And I think to some people that is now a concern as we really take down any walls that existed between the technical college education and a UW 4-year baccalaureate institution.
Okay.
Education.
And as the students realize greater ability to transfer credits from Gateway or a technical college to a University of Wisconsin campus, is this a good thing for the students? Is it a good thing for the university?
Well, it might be a good thing for the students. I say might be because I still think there is a value to being on a 4-year baccalaureate UW campus. I have great respect for what the technical schools do. And let me just insert here that back in 1991, actually some of the resistance to that early articulation package came from the technical college faculty who didn't want to see their distinct role diminished. They were proud of providing technical education. They didn't want to just be a feeder institution. Okay. I think practically for many students, the fact that the gateway or technical college tuition is cheaper, no small consideration in an age where everybody is looking at their finances. I think also for a lot of first-generation students, the idea of going for a 4-year degree might be daunting if you could do smaller bites of it at a less expensive, perhaps less intimidating place. And this, I know, is the gamble for many UW institutions, especially Parkside, is that we will really reap some benefit with transfer students. And just the paper the other day just ran a little article on some statistics. Okay, so this past year, the semester's transfer class is the largest since 2018 and includes 71 students, up 21% from Gateway Technical College, 48 students, up 14% from the College of Lake County. So the gamble is that making it easier for students to come in from 2-year campuses will help us in the long run.
And is there a danger that they won't go from a Gateway or a College of Lake County to Parkside?
There is that risk. They're free to go anywhere they want. They're free to go to Eau Claire, Oshkosh, Whitewater. I think a danger that we also, that I fear for Parkside, we don't need to worry about Madison. They've got more students than they can handle. But something that I see as a challenge for us is that enrollments in those freshman and sophomore courses are what support the upper division courses. You know, you may have a department of 7 or 8 people because 2/3 of their time is involved in teaching a freshman or sophomore course, and then they can teach a small enrollment upper level class. If you drain away the enrollment in those lower division courses, then how does that hurt the programs overall? And especially in this time when the UW system is facing such horrific challenges from underfunding, I see this as a risk.
Yeah, and speaking to that, over your 30 years, how have you seen the effect of outside influences on the university system and particularly Parkside?
Well, this is the worst it's ever been at this moment. One looks back on what is now a golden age, even though we maybe didn't perceive it that way at the time. But I can remember being told when I first came to Parkside by Ken Hoover, someone that some of our viewers may remember fondly. Ken was in political science and had really been, he was actually in the room when Patrick Lucy was launching his bid for governor in 1970 and talked about an idea of merging what were then the 2 systems of higher education, the 4-campus UW system, Madison, Milwaukee, Parkside, Green Bay, and the 9-campus Wisconsin State University system. And Ken's conventional wisdom, which proved to be true for a long time, was that Democrat, Republican, governor, makeup of the legislature, the UW system was going to be okay. A little more funding, a little less funding, but it was something that across the board the state politicians were proud of. Most of them were graduates of a UW or WSU, later all one big UW family. They were graduates of a campus. And they had a UW campus, a 4-year or a 2-year in their district. Well, that has certainly eroded. And I think, again, any of our viewers will know of the current culture war climate in which we live, and higher education has become one of the pawns in that. The funding situation, the UW campuses have just emerged from a 10 or 12-year tuition freeze. Funding under the Republican-dominated legislature, certainly going back to the Scott Walker era when we also had a Republican governor, shrank and shrank. This most recent budget, the UW system put in a plan, a budget for a $458 million increase. Governor Evers shaved that down to a livable $350 million. The legislature cut by 32. So no new money, a taking away of money that was already there.
And you first saw this, felt this, when?
Really felt this in 2011 with the Scott Walker Act 10, which is its own discrete thing, you know, the taking away of collective bargaining. The UW faculty are not, they do not collectively bargain, they are not unionized, but the effects of that were felt on campus among academic staff who are unionized. But that the Act 10 was part of a broader dissing is the only word I can come up with at the moment, of the public sector. And I think that was certainly felt by faculty, and that has only continued. To the point where we have the Speaker of the Assembly in Madison saying that he is ashamed to be a graduate of a UW campus, a graduate of Whitewater as he is. That's the kind of thing, going back to what Ken Hoover talked about, that you would not have heard 30, 40 years ago.
Okay, so you speak that there is kind of a feeling of downplaying a university education. Do you see this growing? Do you see this at a place where it'll probably maintain? You think there'll be some change to that feeling?
Oh, one always hopes. Certainly, when we get students on campus, they experience this transformative power of their education. I have never, even among my students who majored in history and are now working for State Farm Insurance, I have never heard them say that they regret their education. That it opened doors to them, it gave them things they could read, places they could travel to. So there is that. We just need to get them there against all countervailing influences. I think it's fundamental for our American democracy that we have public higher education. And as I knew that this interview was going to be happening, I looked back through some notes that I've used over the years when I've given a talk at the new faculty staff orientation on the history of UW-Parkside and more broadly the history of the UW system. But I think you know, Carl, that the Kenosha News was very involved in the campaign to bring a 4-year UW campus to this area. And your then editor, Howard Brown, gave a full-time release to a staffer at the Kenosha News to do the publicity required, you know, crank out pamphlets and booklets on why we needed a UW campus in this area. And one of the passages that I use in my talk, I'll quote it now. The prevailing attitude is this: here is Kenosha's chance to really grow up, to shed its image as a strictly factory town, and to offer its youngsters the most priceless gift of a free society, an unlimited public education. I think that says it all. And what I also noticed in all of that publicity that Thank You Kenosha News helped to generate to successfully bring Parkside here is the reference to citizens, the citizens of Kenosha, what the citizenry needs. And somewhere along the way, we allowed ourselves to be redefined as taxpayers. And now it's all, well, you know, the taxpayers are footing the bill for these lazy institutions that are teaching critical race theory. And yeah, this is an educated citizenry that we're talking about. And university education, again, its transformative power, the tolerance that it can teach, the breadth of experience it can expose people to. You can't have a democratic society without those things.
Well, some of those who criticize university education point to somehow a focus toward a liberal approach, or a diversity approach, as opposed, and therefore cutting back on other voices from the opposing side. Is there any truth that you feel is in that?
Well, I think there can always be individuals who take things to an extreme, but I think in general, I'm not going to apologize for universities having a more liberal approach, because if you unpack the word liberal, we're talking about freedom, we're talking about tolerance, we're talking about breadth of views. All of these things at its best are what a liberal outlook is. I have certainly had students who are conservative and who identify themselves as such. I have not penalized them, nor can I point to specific examples of colleagues of mine who have done so. They're allowed to speak their piece in class as long as it doesn't stray outside the bounds of becoming offensive. And I would say the same thing for a student with a liberal or progressive view. I always ran a tight classroom in that way, and even ruled out the use of four-letter words or profanity. And we don't talk like that in here, I would say, on a range of things. So I think that faculty, even liberal faculty, who take their role and their profession seriously, provide in the classroom that arena for free discussion. And I think fondly of one student who came to me in our capstone course where they had to write a paper on a significant historian, and he was a student who had had a 25-year military career. And he said, you know, I tend to be kind of conservative. Okay. And he said, but I want to stretch myself and look at the most liberal historian I can find. Okay, so I assigned him Howard Zinn, and the author of A People's History of the United States. Brian and Howard Zinn ended up forming an email correspondence, and Brian went up to Madison to meet Zinn when Howard Zinn was in town for a Mother Jones magazine anniversary celebration. And Zinn invited Brian to join him at lunch with my friend Bob, who turned out to be Robert Redford, who was there because of Redford's environmental interests. Now, I don't know that it ever changed the way Brian voted, and I really don't care. But here was someone, you know, again, self-identified as a conservative who felt respected enough that he himself wanted to step out and look at something different, and what an experience he had. So those are the kinds of things that we can do on a university campus, and I don't know where else that could happen.
Okay, here we are in 2023 with several of the UW campuses facing deficits.
Oh, yeah.
And we're seeing layoffs.
Yeah.
Where do you see the future of Parkside in all of this, and how it changes perhaps going forward?
Oh. Well, again, we are one of the campuses. Yesterday and maybe today, as we're recording this, the consultant firm that President Rothman has engaged is visiting the Parkside campus to look at economies and efficiencies. They are already, it was announced in the paper a week ago, probably 10% layoff. And this really worries me. My own history department, which all the time I was there had 7 faculty members, is currently at 3. I don't know how much deeper you can cut. So I'm worried. I can't sugarcoat it any more than that. But hope springs eternal. You know, if we can come up with, what is it, $350 million to keep the brewers in town, why can't we, under a different political atmosphere, come up with that same amount of money to bail out the UW campuses, to put them back on the footing that they deserve to be? I think as long as there's life, there's hope. If we can hang on through this difficult challenge, we'll will emerge at the end.
And there's a new chancellor at...
And there is a new chancellor, yes, there is a new chancellor coming in January, Chancellor Lynn Akey, who is currently at Mankato State in the Minnesota system. I have not had the chance to meet her. Something that I liked immediately when I heard it is that she has a son going to Parkside. I guess wanting to get out of the Minnesota system where his mother was an administrator, came to Wisconsin. Now she's here too. But certainly anything that I've read about her and her video that she recorded the day after she was named chancellor and put up on the Parkside website, certainly I think some new energy, some new vitality. She knows what she's walking into. So I'm always optimistic. Again, as a European historian, a German historian, who foresaw the peaceful coming down of the Berlin Wall? History can always surprise us. So I hope for good things for Parkside in the future. I love the place. I put my heart and soul into it. And I hope it's there to provide the same kind of transformative experience for not only its students, but also its faculty. It certainly changed me in ways we talked about early in this interview. It made me a better professor and a better teacher than I would have been in a more traditional place. And I hope that opportunity remains there for coming generations.
Thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you so much, Carl. I really enjoyed this. Thanks.